tonight, oh, and for people on Zoom, it's great that you've joined us. We'll be having questions later on, so put them in the chat box on Zoom and we'll pick them up later on. This talk started because I was walking around Bath once and I heard a mayor's guide tell some visitors that if they'd gone, if people from the 18th century were suddenly projected to the present day, the thing they'd notice about Bath would be the noise. But if we were projected back to the 18th century, the thing that we'd notice would be the smells. And I think with Stuart's illustration for the talk tonight, I think to that you have to add spoke as well. So life's changed an awful lot. And I think tonight we may be touching on sensitive subjects of human and animal waste, but who better to talk us round the scatology of this and Stuart, who is absolutely, he's just an expert on Bath's social history and the way people used to live. And of course, he's the director of the the Museum of Bath at Work. And it's great to have you here tonight, Stuart. So may I pass it over to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking me to go. Do you normally have the lights down or up? Is that, you might be able to see some of the pictures a bit more clearly. Well, first of all, thank you for asking me to come. It's a pleasure. And thank you for being able to make it. I am a historian, so I think some of the subjects that I'm going to be talking about have an element of science in them. So don't ask me anything technical about chemistry or atmospheric pollution in a scientific way. This is going to be an historical review, you might say. And talking of history, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the works of Isaac Asimov. You don't need to be a science fiction fan. This short story called The Dead Past was made by the BBC into a play. And The Dead Past is about history and technology. It's set in the future, they always are, aren't they? And it's about a machine called a chronoscope, which allows historians to look into the past. So they can actually watch the past in real time, which is a good idea. And in the past, there's some historians looking at this machinery, and they can't calibrate what year they're looking at, but they see the film and it shows 20th century England. And one of them says, well, you can see how old it is. They're still using ground cars. And then they have a discussion about how awful it must have been in the 20th century, because not only are they having cars that travel on the surface of the earth, but they're burning carbon fuels, and how dreadful the atmosphere must have been to have breathed, and how wonderful it is that they use cars that have, as they described, magnetic motors, which mean they sort of float in midair. And rather as introduced, we look back in the past and talk about how dreadful it was. You can't help wondering how it might be in 200 years' time when they're looking at our own time and what we're doing with the atmosphere and the environment. Anyway, this talk is really about how our appreciation of the atmosphere, how the thing that we breathe in, people have only really started to become concerned about it in the last couple of generations, you might think. It's a concern these days. This is a picture taken in 1971, the Bath Arts Workshop, which was the first organization, you might say, in this area, which was worried about the environment, the pollution of water, pollution of the atmosphere. They had this outdoor event organized by something called the Community Technology Department, of the arts workshop, interested in, you know, wind turbines, solar panels, that the earliest type of alternative technology. But when there is in the 1970s that concern about, particularly after the wreck of the Torrey Canyon, the oil pollution of the sea, you know, there's suddenly an upsurge in interest. But, you know, now probably we're more concerned than ever before in our history about what it is that we're breathing in and out. And it's worth in the looking at Bath and the particular circumstances of Bath, which make it a particular, I mean, even in ancient times, people were aware of the particular topographical influence on how the air moves. This is Bath, as you can see it, and the topography is important. You'll know Bath is at the lower end of the Cotswolds, the Cotswold Plateau that comes south through, you know, Little Salisbury, and the River Avon cuts through a high plateau in a fairly deep valley. And in fact, you know, as the river comes round here, it describes this very steep, it starts to meander on its floodplain. But before it gets to the floodplain here to the west, there is this deep valley it's cut into, beach and cliff to the south, and Lansdowne, and in fact, you know, these other hills, slopes to the north. And so there in the deep valley, sheltered from the prevailing winds, which are sort of coming from this direction, from the southwest, from the south, sheltered, you might say, for good or ill, from all that. And it has a kind of, at least around, you know, this lower part at the center, it has a kind of microclimate. And you will have noticed that, I mean, where I work in Julian Road, you know, even on a sunny day, quite a hot day, the air is moving about, you know, up the slopes, you know, there's much more of a breeze. As soon as you start to get down to Union Street or into Stall Street, you can feel the air has stopped moving. And unless it happens to be coming from a direction where it will be channeled along this valley here, so say it's coming from, you know, something like the northwest or, you know, due east, you know, the air at the bottom of the valley will not move very much. It gets very humid, you probably know. This is as an example of how that, even in the 18th century, you know, people were aware of it. In 1784, a hydrogen balloon is released from Julian Road, the first balloon to be released in this area. What they called an aerolite, takes off from Julian Road, and it's the reason why in Bristol there's something called Air Balloon Road. I don't know if anyone's ever come across it, because that's where the balloon landed. The balloon from, and it's only at that height from the centre of Bath that you could get enough wind. You have to be right on the edge of the what was in those days was the new town, in order that there was sufficient breeze to take the balloon up. And this is in the middle of winter, so the wind came from the east, blew the balloon to the west. Just going back a moment, one of the things that this topography unfortunately emphasizes, you might say, is a phenomenon that you get in cold weather, which is temperature inversions, which is where, particularly in still weather, an area of warm air will sit on top of an area of cold air and will trap it, and will trap the air to the extent that not only does it not move, but any pollution or any smells that happen to be in it are capped. This is what happened in the London smogs of the early 1950s, the sort of desperate, emergencies, almost atmospheric emergencies caused by these temperature inversions. And this topography, particularly in the lower part of the city, is just exaggerated by the hills. You might be asking, well, in that case, why is it that the town is all the way down there? Well, it's because the Roman settlement, or at least part of it, that was around the hot water springs, is at the lowest part of the city. It's on the floodplain, more of that in a moment, but that's where the springs are. Now, this drawing here was done, I think, probably in the 1970s. We now have got a rather better idea of Roman Bath because, in fact, for a long time, people thought the Roman town was entirely surrounding the spa, entirely surrounding the hot waters. We now know, in fact, that there was a great deal more development in Walcott and London Road and Hedgemead and places like that. And in fact, where the Roman springs were, was a kind of compound which was devoted entirely to the functions of the baths and the temple. As a result of that, after the Roman town and all this Roman development, falls into disuse, this is where the medieval town will be situated. It will sort of contract back. And at the time, when the population of Bath, even in the 13th century is probably only about hundreds of people. I mean, it doesn't really matter very much about temperature inversions and smog and anything like that, because the place is not much bigger than a village. As time has gone on, this unfortunate, well, not unfortunate, I mean, this siting of the center of the city on a site that's on the floodplain and in this deep valley will, as I say, will make the movement of air and this, having the smells, collect. I mentioned about the flooding. This picture was taken in the summer of 1968, the last time there was a serious flood, up Southgate Street. I mean, if you think the river used to flood quite frequently, almost as far up as the Roman baths. And this water coming up, well, that's not a problem when it's not being polluted, but it increasingly becomes a problem with the more and more stuff that is put into it as the city starts to evolve. So I think, the medieval town, the Roman town, when it comes to waste disposal and the creation of atmospheric pollution, I mean, it really isn't a problem. That problem's going to come a little bit later on. I mean, this is the medieval town, and for most of the city's history, it's worth saying it's been a provincial market town. It served its agricultural hinterland from which they get food and meat and what have you, which is processed in the town for resale. It's really not until the 18th century that things start to change. Now, during this time, well, the kind of things that are going on, which were pretty unpleasant and create rather odorous waste, would include, slaughtering, disposal of human waste. Well, that's fairly ad hoc in those days. It's they're burning wood for fires. Incidentally, the Romans are the first people in Rome, this is, I have to say, not small provincial towns like Bath. The Romans are the first ones to identify smog, that is a combination of fog and smoke, or smoke in the atmosphere, which they called heavy heaven. That was a rather nice expression to describe, smoke hanging in the air without it being moved by a wind or breeze or anything else. So, animal waste, well, that's pretty unpleasant. This is leather dressing. That's a really smelly process. Even in most recent times, when this picture was taken, which was in the early 20th century, you steep animal hides in urine for long periods of time. And this sort of, this removes animal fat and matter from the hides. It's like a caustic solution. And that's pretty smelly. But as I say, the town is fairly small. Things, what smells there are, people just got on with. As introduced, really, it was just a fact of life that there was going to be smells, along with, probably fairly low life expectancy. That all changes in the 18th century, when Bath turns into this sort of pioneer town, making money from visitors and from health tourism, you might say. And what begins a period of about 300 years of industrialized leisure, really. We're still in that period where the city generates income from people spending money in it. It still has those functions of a market town, but suddenly it's got an increased population, resident population, and an increasing number of visitors. Between 1700 and 1800, the population of Bath rises from about 3,000 residents to about 30,000 residents, and the number of visitors expands from about 2,000 visitors rather, to about 20,000. So in the high season, you may have 50,000 people in the city, a little less than that most probably. But there are a lot of people will have come through the city in the course of a year. And it's the spa that is the attraction, you might say, or at least the sort of excuse for coming, for those people who have the time and money to do it. And so this increase in population is putting a strain on waste disposal in the first instance, and it's going to greatly increase the pollution of the atmosphere. One of the reasons for that has to do with when the city is at its busiest. 18th century Bath and into the first part of the 19th century, the fashionable season is between autumn and spring. So it's during the winter months, which is incidentally why those people who describe the atmosphere of Bath, people like Jane Austen, for example, who talk about how miserable it appears, as Jane Austen talks about coming down from Kingsdown and seeing the city in this kind of, through a mist of rain and misery and fog. This is the reason why people writing about the city, describing it, they're coming in the winter. They're seeing it, not like it is at the moment. They're seeing it at its worst, you might say, climatically speaking. They're coming down into the deep valley, and they're not getting the best impression of it. It's cold, that kind of thing. The expansion of the building stock, not just the grand ones like this, the circus, but all the artisan dwellings, expanding at the time that people are burning more and more coal. Up until the 18th century, although coal had been burnt, domestically speaking, by and large, the amounts that were traveling about, partly because the transport system was so poor, and partly because digging coal at depths was difficult, because technologically speaking, they didn't have the pumping machinery and the lifting equipment to get the coal to the surface. That all starts to change in the 18th century. There's more coal about. People are less likely to be burning coal. Not likely to be burning wood, charcoal, or anything like that. So there's a lot more coal smoke going into the atmosphere, and you only need to see the size of these houses here that you get some idea, the larger houses, how much smoke is going to be being created. Incidentally, as a child, I can remember this, houses that had been stained by the atmosphere, and those houses which had been cleaned. You know, they sort of, I remember walking along Great Pulteney Street and there were odd houses that had been cleaned when the majority had not, and progressively they were. One of the things that was a sort of misconception until the 20th century really is that this is entirely caused by smoke. And a lot of those measures which were put in place in the 19th century to try and cut down on pollution and those respiratory diseases which were felt to be caused by it, people thought it was entirely to the particulates that were coming from the smoke. We now know that it's the chemicals in those the products of combustion, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, which are part of one of the major reasons why these things are stained like this and why people suffer these dreadful complaints. Yeah, the great Georgian building projects, the circus, for example. So that's one thing, you know, the housing, there's a great expansion in the population and the waste that they're creating, and the ad hoc collection of human waste, you know, that has to change. And that's not a very particularly sanitary process. From the 18th century, the most common way of collecting waste was that it was collected at night from what they sometimes call chapels of ease or necessary houses, if you had one. Quite often, this was just carried in buckets to the river, where the point about flooding, because quite often, if the river is the place where all the filth is going, every time it floods, it kind of, you know, repeats on those who disposed of it in the first instance. The other thing, the rather more sophisticated way, was cess tanks, collection of waste in these tanks, which operated in a natural way, you might say. Here's one. The idea was that I don't want to upset anyone's, you know, delicate digestion here, but the solid matter would sink to the bottom and the liquid matter would float to the top, and that would drain off, or it would soak through, rather like septic tanks do. And eventually, this sediment, as they called it, would completely fill the tank, at which point they needed to be emptied physically. So, you know, that's, you know, there are not are foul sewers in 18th century Bath. They simply do not exist. So it's domestically, it's a fairly smelly city. This picture, believe it or not, this picture was taken in the 1920s. This is night soil men, not in Bath, in Bristol, would you believe it? In outer parts of Bristol, where they would collect, as you can see, containers from you know, toilets that weren't plumbed in. So that's pretty unpleasant. And as I say, it's the river where everything is going ultimately. I mean, even when in the early part of the 20th century, you know, we have a sewer system. Such sewers as they are depositing the waste, liquid and solid, straight into the river. So that makes the river pretty unpleasant. It's also the place where waste from slaughterhouses goes, for example. This here, you might recognize, is this is the site of what will become Pulteney Bridge. So it's before Pulteney Bridge. This is the mill at Bathwick, and this is the site of what will become the Parade Gardens in the 19th century. And unfortunately, for the people who might be, well, looking across, most of the slaughtering is going on in Walcott, which is upstream And in the 20th century, people talk about seeing, the waste from these slaughterhouses floating past the parade gardens, along with all sorts of other waste that's going into the river from Walcott. So, when people talk about, oh, well, isn't it a shame that until the 19th, 20th century, Bath sort of turns its back on the river, well, there's a pretty good reason why they might want to. And of course, as I say, this is also, it's flooding. And all that filth that goes into the river is coming back onto the land. So flooding is not just a disaster from the point of view of damaged homes, it's a health hazard. I mentioned about chimneys and smoke. I mean, you only need to count the number of chimneys on the top of a chimney, of a Georgian townhouse. That's the number of flues. And because the houses are being occupied, those by visitors, in the winter, that's when it's coldest. That's when they're using as much coal. And if you've been into a house, like for example, number 1, the Royal Crescent, you see how high the ceilings are. So if it's a cold period, it really is belching out of these chimneys. Now, as it happens, a lot of these larger houses are on the hills going up towards Lansdowne. They're where the air is clearer. But there are plenty of houses down on the lower parts of the city in, the Avon Street district, for example, Southgate, what will become Dorchester Street, and Widcombe, the lower parts of Bathwick, where there are lots of artisan dwellings, where there's just as much filth being put into the atmosphere. And it's at those lower levels where the smoke is not moving. In the winter, when you get these temperature inversions, when the dry air is capping the cold air below, the filth is being capped in. It gets very cold. I mean, the climate in Bath is fairly mild, but I mean, it will get, it does get very cold in the winter. This is the 1962 winter on the outskirts of Bath. And it's when, these chimney breasts, the first fire grates that come from Coalbrookdale down the River Severn to Bristol and along the River Avon to Bath, fitting these houses with the latest heating technology, but burning coal. And the coal is coming from close by. By the early part of the 18th century, coal is being extracted on the edge of Bath. This here is, there's the River Avon. This is what will become the Lower Bristol Road. And this is what will become the Newton St Low dual carriageway. So this is the junction with the Upper Bristol Road. This is where Newbridge is, and Newbridge itself. So this is that junction. I expect there's a roundabout there now and traffic lights. And I don't know whether you can see here, it says fire engine and coal mine. So just there, and in fact, there was another one here. It says coal mine, if you can see. Belonged to the Gore-Langton family of Newton St Low. So coal is being mined on the outskirts of the city and brought into Bath to feed all those fireplaces. And it's this smoke coming out, forming a great pall over the center of the lower part of the city, at least. As I say, further up, the breeze is keener. But this is one of the reasons why, those commentators talk about how dreadful the city looks and how you could taste the filth in the atmosphere. Come the 19th century, population increases again. The city, you might say, ceases to be a fashionable resort, but that doesn't mean the amount of waste or atmospheric pollution is going to reduce. Industrialization on a factory scale in Bath is fairly modest. I mean, there are factories and chimney, you know, oh, sorry, that's right down here. Oh. No. Where do we get to them? That is one of the mills at Twerton. It's a textile mill. In fact, this is the site of student union accommodation now, in fact. And you can see the factory chimneys, tall. The reason why they're so tall, incidentally, is because this is near the river. This is at the low level. They need to be tall because if they aren't, they won't get any movement of air that will draw the fires. If you go to on the London Road, just by the junction with Cleveland Bridge, there's a row of houses on the left called Anglo Terrace, which is in front of what used to be the Anglo-Bavarian Brewery, which is now Birdle's Yard. And there's a house on the which adjoins on Anglo Terrace, which adjoins Walcott Parade, and it's got a very tall chimney, and the chimney runs up the side of Walcott Parade. So it's a very, but this is because the houses are so low near the river that they simply wouldn't be able to draw the fires unless the chimney was a super height. So that's the reason why these chimneys are so tall. You know, it's not just to get rid of the pollution, it's so they can draw a draft. There are smoke coming from steam locomotives because, you know, this is the age of coal being used in industry. This Green Park Station, I mean, you can see what they're doing for the environment, pumping that kind of filth into it. And what you might call public enemy number one when it comes to pollution of every kind, you know, comes in 1819 when Bath gets one of the world's first gasworks. One of the things about the large scale industry in Bath is that it's restricted as to where it can go. Because the valley of Bath is quite narrow, it needs to, and you need quite a lot of room for things like gasworks. Well, they have to be laid out where there is flat land, and the only real flat land which is near anything like the transport network, like the railways or the river, is on the floodplain to the west of the city. There's a corridor of flat land which stretches from Churchill Bridge right out to Twerton, and this area of flattish land is where this heavy industry is, such as there is, you know, the railway yards, the gasworks, the Twerton wool mills. Unfortunately, it being to the west, it means any smoke and smell that is generated from here is caught by those prevailing winds and goes east. So during the time of the great age of factories, you know, what factory smoke there is heading straight into the centre of Bath, or it's heading up towards Lansdowne and all those fancy houses of crescents and terraces. So this, you might say, another accident of topography. The available land for factories, for large-scale development, has to be to the west. It certainly can't be to the east. When the gasworks opens, it's visible from the Royal Crescent. There's a great deal of to do about that. The City Council is pressurised not to allow it because it will be visible from Lansdowne. But it has to be at the lowest point because the gas, you know, needs to, they don't want to pump it downhill. Gas will rise by itself if they don't need to pump it particularly hard. it will rise through any mains through the rest of the city. So it helps if you've got it right next to the lowest point. It's not public enemy number one, partly because of the smell that it produces, the fumes as a byproduct. I mean, as the 20th century goes on, there is more and more technology to reduce that. But in the 19th century, I mean, people are always complaining about gasworks, but they are a fact of life, you might say, in those days. You can't get round having them if you want lighting and gas for cooking. They also pollute the river with gasworks quite often are called chemical works in the 19th century because they make a range of products, including gas. There are a range of chemicals that can be made as byproducts of tar. But the one thing that they find they can't reduce or a real use can't be found for is something called ammoniacal liquor. And this is a highly poisonous byproduct of the process. And that occasionally escapes into the river. It gets into sewers and that kills anything it comes into contact with. In 1940, there's an escape of this. I mean, it contains cyanide, this liquor, kills everything for 3 miles to the west of Bath, down the River Avon, kills all fish life, and it also knocks out the sewage treatment works at Salford. But, you know, this you know, creates a great deal of smell in the 19th century. So along with all the smoke and what have you, there's the smoke and smells coming from these chemical plants. The thing that really we're living with now is the pollution that we get from motor vehicles. During the 20th century, well, in fact, towards the end of the 19th century, as I mentioned a bit earlier, various measures are put in place to abate the smoke. People thought it was the smoke that was doing the problem, the particulates. That's all the problem. That's why people were getting respiratory diseases. That's why buildings were being stained. That's why there was a dreadful smell. That's why, you know, people were coughing and what have you. We now know, as I said before, it's these dioxides in the smoke and the chemicals which are doing the damage. And it's these chemicals which are present in motor fumes. Ironically, you know, as we've come into the post-war period and the Clean Air Act of 1956, for example, you know, the introduction of smokeless fuels, disappearance of heavy industry, the use of cleaner fuels like natural gas, for example. You know, ironically, all of those kind of pollutants, those kind of smelly things, and the development of a proper sewage disposal system. Bath has sewage treatment works at Salford, which opens in 1914. That's before the city of Bristol. We got there before some of these bigger cities, and sewage is pumped from intercepting sewers, the old system of sewerage, which deposited everything straight into the river, ceases in 1914. It all goes to Salford and is, quotes, disposed of safely, end quotes. So all of those sort of smells, all of those smells that had been associated with the development of the city and its growth, you know, seem to be being tackled. It's the motor car, which is the thing that, you know, we are living with now. And that's what I think those historians of the future who were talking about, you know, their ground cars and magnetic motors, that's the thing that, you know, they'll be chastising us for. Colin Buchanan was one of the first road planners, transport expert, used to work for the Ministry of Transport, and it couldn't be it couldn't be a better title for a book, could it? You know, the motor car couldn't be more of a mixed blessing than and this rather sort of menacing motor car, you know, approaching the town, quite apart from all the things it does to compromise our enjoyment of somewhere like Bath. When in 1964, Colin Buchanan's employed by Bath City Council to come up with a proposal to reduce the amount of traffic through the centre, he says he can't believe how the urban landscape of Bath had been so compromised by the motor car. He says, you know, civilized urban living should not be compromised by seeing motor cars, let alone smelling them and breathing in their fumes. He said that, you know, there was visual pollution, that there's noise pollution from the motor car, let alone what's being pumped into the atmosphere. And, you know, as an attempt to mitigate that domination of the environment by the motor car, you know, comes up with his plan, the notorious Buchanan plans for Bath. And this is at a time when it was thought that the motor car and its use could be managed by diverting it, really, not reducing its use, accepting that increased use and the increased pollution would be something we'd have to live with, which is it's hard to imagine how that would be a kind of reasonable solution in some ways. And that the way that the pollution, both visual and atmospheric, of Bath could be reduced would be by diverting the through traffic under the city through a tunnel and through a series of circulatory systems at either end of it in his plan for Bath of 1965. And it is the motor car which is responsible for a lot of those health conditions or you know, the potential health conditions that we have, let alone what it's doing to the architecture, because it is the pollutants from it, from car fumes, the nitrogen dioxides and sulfur dioxides, which are affecting the stone, how Bath stone, which looks beautiful but is friable, easily affected by changes in the environment. And the plan is abandoned for good, again, probably for good. A lot of people thought it shouldn't have been abandoned. We now have all sorts of other measures in place to reduce the pollution, the clean air zone, for example. You know, the various congestion charges that are existing across the country and have been introduced in the city, park and ride schemes and things like that. So we're in the position now where all those historic smells and pollutants may well have been reduced, but we are left with what you can hear outside the windows of this building, you know, the sound of motor cars. However, they're being replaced by electric ones. We'll still have for quite a while those smells and what have you. And this is, as I say, it's a live concern. Coming right back to that first slide, you wonder if we're going to survive, how we will be living in 200 years' time. One hopes in the same way as we can be rather censorious when we're reviewing the history of the 19th and 20th centuries. People would be censorious about us. And as introduced right at the very beginning, the noise is something that certainly people from the past would recognize. I think the smells that we have now, I think it would be different smells. It would be the fumes. My sister went to the new development of the Battersea Power Station the other day. I don't know if anyone is aware of it, but Battersea Power Station, which ironically, you know, with the great sort of belches of carbon filth into the atmosphere, She went into this new development, which is a combination of shops and accommodation, and the whole interior is perfumed. The air is sort of tainted with a perfume to make it smell nice. And you think, well, if that's what the future is going to be. I mean, I always think sometimes going to London is like going to Mars. You know, they seem to be like sort of 50 years ahead of the rest of the country. And when my sister came back and said, you know, now the smells that could be the what you'd experience in an urban development might be like perfumed air. It seems the most bizarre thing. So maybe that will be the pollutants of the future, or rather the atmosphere of the future will be one which is fragranced. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope it's been of interest. That sort of scamper through the city's sort of topography and what have you. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you have.
Stuart. Switch this on. Thank you, Stuart. Trying to get this to. Is it on now? Yes, it's on now. Right. So if I could ask any questions from the room to talk to the microphone, because then they can hear it online.
It's a comment, really. When you talked about chimneys belching smoke, it reminded me of Manchester in the 40s and 50s, before they had smokeless zones. People who perhaps too mean to employ a sweep would let their chimney go on fire, and you'd see flames and thick black smoke belching out, making it even worse than ordinary flame. Do they ever do that in Bath?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you, I mean, this is a time of sending young boys up chimneys, isn't it, to clean them? But no, you do get that.
Yeah.
You do get unswept chimneys. I wouldn't say bursting into flames, but I mean, they sort of slowly combust quite often. Yeah, it's a commonplace.
They didn't see the fire engine wasn't in attendance.
No.
So just do it and just let it burn.
Yeah, let them burn out. Yeah, I mean, in the age of coal, everything is burning, and, you know. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, but there's another. I'll go to the back of the room. So, you first then.
Question about sewers. You said that the Salford sewer works came in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
So the Bath sewer system, is it aging like in other cities, like in London? And, you know, how is it going to be lasting over the next few years?
I think, in fact, Wessex Water, bless them, I mean, they have done quite a lot of work. Ironically, when I showed you that slide of the coal mines at Newton St Low, the coal mines on the floodplain by the Newton St Low dual carriageway, those pits are still there. They were run for about 100 years, from the 1730s to the 1830s. They only abandoned them when they were flooded by river water. They simply couldn't pump out the water because they're on the floodplain. I mean, they're not far from the river. But ironically, Wessex Water are using them as part of the sewage disposal system. So they're using these pits to help transfer the sewage from Bath to Bristol, to the Salford works. So that's given them sort of increased capacity, their underground workings. So I think that probably is in fairly good condition. That's been fairly recently as well. So.
Okay, shall I?
I was interested to hear you talking about Anglo Terrace, which is actually currently one of the locations that, as we speak, is still one of the most polluted places in Bath, according to Bain's data.
Absolutely.
But what I wanted to ask was, there have been brass foundries and obviously engineering works like Stothert and Pitt in Bath, which you didn't really touch on, but you might expect to have different kinds of smells and waste. And I just wondered if you had any comments about that.
I think that there've been There've been every kind of industrial development in Bath. I mean, the engineering works at Stothart's, brass foundries, cabinet making works and that kind of thing. But by comparison to somewhere like Bristol, the development that there has been fairly modest. And I suppose that's I mean, there'd be all kinds of smells. I mean, on the subject of slaughtering, those of you who've lived in Bath a while might remember that until 1971, there was a sort of industrialized slaughterhouse in the centre of Bath, in Southgate, what was euphemistically called the pork factory of Spears Brothers and Clark, where there's industrialized slaughtering right in the centre, and the smell from that was pretty unpleasant. I mean, in my time, well, I can remember my mum talking about Spears Brothers, but there was a slaughterhouse in Cheltenham Street on the other side of the river. So yeah, there's all kinds of smells, all kinds of development, and I wasn't meaning to belittle it. It's just, I think, by comparison to things like domestic coal and the motor car, the smells and pollution that's coming is of a lower sort of level of danger.
Claire, have you got any online? Or? No, okay.
Going back to Georgian times, how badly did people smell?
You mean their personal hygiene? Well, I suppose it would depend who you are. I suppose it would depend whether you could afford to have a change of clothes regularly, or you could have access to water supply. I think if you were living in some of the artisan dwellings in the lower part of the city, where all the sewerage is floating in the river and the water supply is contaminated at the very least, it would be pretty odorous, I would have thought. I think people by the 18th century, I mean, having a regular wash is starting to become a bit more common if you can afford it. If you're coming to somewhere like Bath, I mean, they may not have running water, a lot of these houses, although some do. Particularly, I mean, one of the things about Lansdowne is that there's a spring line that runs along the hillside. So, you know, Julian Road, for example, you know, where the Museum of Bath at Work is on a spring line. It's the spring that gives rise to the Charlcombe Lane springs, for an example. There are springs under Hedgemead Park and Victoria Park. So there's a running water supply, you know, close by. So I think if you could afford it and, you know, you were fairly well off, you could have access to water. I think in the lower part of the city, it probably must have been pretty unpleasant.
Okay, are there any more questions? And one over there, right.
Firstly, in answer to the First Lady, I can recall as a student in about 1970 in Aberdeen that we set fire to our chimney. All the chimneys were granite, and that was a fairly standard method of sweeping them. If I come to Bath, normally I come by public transport because it's a fairly small city and you can get around quite well. If I come by car, it's because I want to go somewhere else. And Bath is in the way, and Bath hasn't learnt, unlike London, Oxford, Edinburgh, that people don't necessarily want to go there. And if there was a ring road, then I'm sure a lot of people would not come to Bath. They're obliged to at the moment. I've plotted out on a map. If one put a ring road of A roads using the existing A roads and put a ring round Bath, you could fit in that ring the London congestion charge, plus Oxford Ring Road, plus Edinburgh Ring Road, all separately within the one ring road around Bath. It needed something doing in the middle of the 20th century. It still needs something doing about it.
No, I mean, I think the Buchanan proposals, I mean, one of the things Buchanan considered was a ring road. But I think the issue was because of the topography, because of the need for the road to really take a very large loop around the city, it was going to be as expensive as building a tunnel. I think the idea of the tunnel, on the face of it, seems like a grand idea. You know, you simply hide a dual carriageway under the hill. On the face of it, I think the reason why there was so much objection was in fact not to do with the tunnel, but to do with what was going to happen at either end, which was how you would incorporate, you know, a dual carriageway into the existing road system. And I think there was a great deal of opposition about what was going to happen in Walcott and on the Lower Common to the west. But I think you're right. I think the thing that Buchanan identified was that the A4, I mean, before 1964, the A4 was considered the worst road. The A4 passing through Bath was considered to be the worst bit of any A road in England. And the worst place is a stone's throw from here, which is the junction of Gay Street and George Street. I mean, if you think that all the traffic that was traveling from London to the west to Bristol was having to negotiate the junction by the Oxfam shop, and then coming into Queen Square, and then going on to the Upper Bristol Road, you know, articulated lorry. I mean, there's some footage taken in the early 1960s of the great big lorries negotiating that corner. It was, as you say, a lot of the traffic was not stopping in Bath, it was passing straight through it. And the tunnel was thought to be the best way of dealing with that. I suppose the building of the M4, M5 mitigated that to an extent, but I think you're right. I think part of the problem is even with these issues, even with these developments, there is still through traffic that you to live with, I suppose, for now.
Okay. Right. Well, I've got a question actually, Stuart. In that picture, the photograph you showed of the circus and the smoke darkened circus, the houses were much darker at the bottom than at the top. It seemed to be darker at the bottom and then lighter as you went up. I would have thought it was the other way around. I mean, do you know why that was?
It could be the photograph.
Oh.
I mean, I don't is the answer to the question. I don't know. It may have something to do with the fact that there are heavier elements in the pollutants that are lower down. I think this is where you need an atmospheric chemist, really. But I mean, I know these, you know, these early color photographs, the colors sometimes a bit off, so it may well be something to do with the developing. But yeah, I think you need someone from the scientific establishment to answer that one.
It's just another comment, really. I remember on the first day of when I started doing a sociology degree from 1760 to the present day, which was in the 1960s, the lecturer saying the first thing she said to us all was, before the advent of mass-produced cotton, everybody smelt disgusting. Partly because you inherited your grandparents' clothes. Clothes were recycled and recycled. If you can imagine it, felt and wool impregnated with the sweat of generations. So it was the colonial exploitation of cotton which delivered us from bad smells at the time of Jane Austen, really.
Yeah, and I think on Bog Island, there were public baths, private baths that you went in and you paid sixpence and you got a towel and you could use a bath because there weren't baths in the houses in that part of town. Yeah. Well, I think we've reached the end. I don't think there's any more questions. So I can just say, I said at the beginning, Stuart is the director of the Museum of Bath at Work, and there's a couple of events you've got going there, haven't you? The exhibition about faces, and I think we were talking earlier about the competition for Bath's Young Inventor of the Year.
Yeah, I mean, the Museum of Bath at Work is the city's museum of local history, really. I mean, it's the museum of the city's working life, which most of us have to do most of the time, whether it's paid or unpaid, you know, working. So the subject matter of the museum really is, well, most of the people who live in it and how they've worked over the years. And we for the past couple of years, we've awarded in collaboration with other organisations, and at one point with this organisation, the Bath Young Inventor of the Year competition. If you know of anyone who is between the ages of about 7 and 16, who you think may be an inventor and can come up with some invention that will save the world, is the slogan of the competition for 2024. Saving the world through invention. So if you know anyone who is able to come up with an idea, they've got until the 8th of September, and submissions can be made through the Museum of Bath at Work website. So if you want to have a look at that. We've also got a series of temporary exhibitions at the moment. We've got an exhibition of photographs of portraits, people taken at the end of the 19th century. 500 negative plates were saved from a photographic studio which used to be in the corridor. As a child, I can remember there being a photographic studio next to the record shop in the corridor. And Lehman Brothers, who were not the Lehman Brothers, you know, that Lehman Brothers, these Lehman Brothers, they took over the photographic studios of Frieze Green, the pioneer cinematographer and photographer. And we have a collection of 500 photographs, negative plates, identified only by their surname, because in those days, you paid to have your photograph taken, but you didn't pay for the negative. The photographer kept the negative. You got prints when you wanted them, but you had to go back to the place where you'd had your photograph taken. So we've got all these negative plates, which are identified only by their surname. And over the last year or so, we have attempted to identify them by using census records. And we've identified about 50 of them. So that's not bad out of 500, 400, you know, it's just over 10%. We've managed to identify them as Bathonians, and we know a great deal about them because we found out from their census records. So we're doing all of those kind of products. On the subject of what I've been talking about this evening, we're staging an exhibition next year, which is called Disposable: Bath and its Changing Environment. Over the last 300 years. So we're actually having an exhibition about this kind of thing, changes in land use, pollution, the building of the Georgian city and that kind of thing are going to be covered by an exhibition, which we will be holding next year. So I hope you can make it.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was a great talk.